Although today's race-obsessed cancel culture eagerly destroys Southern icons, objective observers may also want to ponder whether the North's historical racism warrants comparable retribution. Regarding the postbellum era, modern elites falsely presume the Northerner to have been racially enlightened because he promoted black suffrage and racial equality in the conquered South, if not the North. In truth, however, Northern motives were more selfish than altruistic. After dominating the federal government during the Civil War, Northern Republicans sought to retain their control afterward by annexing easily manipulated voting bloc of ex-slaves to fabricate Republican-controlled puppet regimes in the South. Although the party's 1860 platform opposed geographic expansion of slavery, few members were truly pro-black. They may have been anti-slavery, but they were not pro-black. Until the last 50 years or so, Northern elites idealized the black man at a distance, but rejected him as a neighbor. In contrast, the Southerner often worked with his black neighbor, but wanted to keep him somewhat distant socially. This speech concentrates on 3 points concerning postbellum Northern racism as it existed well into the 20th century. First, selfish Republican Reconstruction motive. Second, Northern desires to confine blacks in the South. And 3, noteworthy Northern racist and racism incidents. Regarding the first point, notwithstanding that today's cultural elites claim that postbellum Republicans promoted black suffrage as a moral impulse, the chief objective was to create a Republican-controlled puppet government regimes in the South to keep the infant GOP in power in Washington by gaining new electors, senators, and congressmen from the carpetbag regimes. When the Civil War ended, the Republican Party was barely 10 years old. It might have been strangled in its cradle if readmittance of the Southern states failed to be manipulated in a way to prevent Southerners from allying with Northern Democrats to regain federal control. Consequently, Republicans settled on 2 goals. First was mandatory black suffrage in the former Confederate states, where the inexperienced black voters could be directed to support Republican interest. White carpetbaggers and scallywags learned that they could control the black vote with political patronage at the local level while reserving most of the state and federal offices for themselves. Since few freedmen paid any taxes, the vassal governments also spent state funds liberally. The money was raised through high property taxes and reckless and often fraudulent borrowings, which could provide a comparative money shower for well-connected leaders within both the black and white communities of the carpetbag regimes. The second goal was to deny political power to the Southern white classes most likely to oppose Republicans locally. This was accomplished by disfranchising ex-Confederates through various federal and carpetbag state actions. As a result, for example, in the 1868 Republican, when Ulysses Grant won the 1868 Republican presidency, he did so with only a minority of the white vote. His seemingly decisive 214 to 80 electoral college vote margin hinged upon black suffrage and the suppression of the Confederate vote, of the ex-Confederate vote. Former Confederates were not only disfranchised in the 10 southern states by the 1868 14th Amendment, but there were also separate suppressions in Missouri, Tennessee, and West Virginia, which were not covered by the 14th Amendment. The combination of ex-Confederate disfranchisement and the Freedmen's voting bloc gave Grant 67 of his 214 electoral votes, without which the 1868 election that put him in the White House would have been an electoral college tie. Thus, Republican fears about losing command of the federal government as a consequence of failing to control the Southern black vote, those fears were realistic. The monolithic freedmen's vote was not merely a secondary bonus to a racially enlightened Republican policy as commonly portrayed by academic historians today. A month after General Lee's surrender, Union Major General William T. Sherman wrote a colleague, quote, "I have never heard a Negro ask for voting rights, and I think it would be his ruin. I believe the whole idea of giving votes to Negroes is to create just that many votes to be used by others for political purposes," close quote. Similarly, in his autobiography, Up from Slavery, Booker T. Washington wrote, quote, "In many cases, it seemed to me that the ignorance of my race was being used as a tool with which to help white men into office, and that there was an element in the North which wanted to punish the Southern white man by forcing the Negro into positions over the head of Southern whites." That's a quote from Booker T. Washington. South Carolina's last carpetbag governor, Daniel Chamberlain, candidly admitted that Republicans sponsored black suffrage mainly to get political power when he wrote in 1901 in the Atlantic magazine, quote, "Underneath all of the avowed motives lay a deeper cause, the will and determination to secure party ascendancy and control at the South and in the nation through the Negro vote. If this is hard of saying, let anyone ask himself if it is possibly credible that in 1867 the Reconstruction Acts would have passed if the Negro vote had been believed to be democratic," close quote. Even the party's chief proponents of those acts, those Reconstruction Acts, the chief proponent was Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, and he indirectly conceded Chamberlain's point. In January 1867, he said, quote, "If black suffrage is excluded in the rebel states, then every one of them is sure to send a solid rebel representative delegation to Congress. They, with their kindred northern copperheads, would always elect the president and control Congress," close quote. He added that the southern states ought never to be counted as valid states until the Constitution shall have been amended to secure the perpetual ascendancy of the Union Party, meaning the Republican Party. Nonetheless, Republicans were loyal to the Southern black man only so long as they needed his vote. By the start of the Civil War, the party realized that the territories west of the Missouri River would be organically Republican. That was evident after the first four states, California, Minnesota, Oregon, and Kansas, sliced out of those territories, entered the Union as Republican strongholds. This was so because the natural migration to those lands was from the states northwest of the Ohio River, where blacks were disliked and represented only about 1% of the population. The key, as Lincoln himself put it in an 1854 speech 7 years before the Civil War started, was to reserve the western territories for whites. Thus, the second point concerning northern motives was to confine blacks in the South. And this is evidenced by contemporary confessions and supported by the slow postbellum dispersion of blacks into other parts of the country. In truth, Abraham Lincoln's 1860 Republican Party platform plank to ban slavery in the Western territories was really designed to, scare quotes, quarantine blacks, not merely slaves, but blacks in the South. 6 years earlier, in 1854, when speaking about the future expansion, Lincoln said, "The whole nation is interested that the best use shall be made of these Western territories. We want them for the homes of free white people," close quote. 5 years later, California Republican gubernatorial candidate Leland Stanford said, quote, "I prefer the white man to the Negro as an inhabitant to our country. I believe its greatest good has been derived by having all the country settled by free white men," close quote. In fact, the plank even predated the plank that called for the ban of slavery into the Western territories. That even predated the Republican Party. It originated in 1846 when future Republican Senator, then Democratic Congressman, David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, introduced a rider to a funding bill for the then current Mexican War. Speaking in favor of his rider that would ban slavery in any territories that America might acquire as a result of that war, Wilmot said, quote, "I make no war upon the South, nor upon slavery in the South. I have no squeamish sensitivities upon the subject of slavery, nor morbid sympathy for the slave. I plead the cause of white freemen. I would preserve for free white labor a fair country, a rich inheritance, where the sons of toil of my own race and own color can live without the disgrace which the association of Negro slavery brings upon free labor," close quote. As for postbellum evidence that Northerners wanted to quarantine blacks in the South, consider that blacks composed only 1% or less for 20 of the 22 states that joined the Union after Texas in 1845. The two exceptions were the border states of West Virginia and Ohio. So from Texas statehood in 1845 down to the present day, every state except two that joined the Union with less than 1% or less of their population being black. The two exceptions, Oklahoma and West Virginia. Moreover, the first 12 states that joined the Union after Southern secession each entered with 2 Republican senators, a party hostile to Southern interests and their free trade proclivities. Not until Oklahoma in 1907 did a postbellum state enter the Union with a Democrat senator. By then, the Republican Party did not need Southern black votes. During the 50 years between the Civil War and President Woodrow Wilson's 1912 election, Grover Cleveland was the solitary Democrat to get into the White House. Yet he was only barely able to win 2 non-consecutive terms. Republicans retained enough power to block his attempts to reduce tariffs, an agenda that was vital to the South's export economy. Getting lower tariffs was vital to the South's export economy. Consequently, Northern tariff-protected manufacturers in cotton textiles, iron products, and wool products especially, continued to hold monopolies or near monopolies on their goods domestically. A lot of people misunderstand the purpose of protective tariffs. Protective tariffs are not to raise revenue. Protective tariffs are used to block competition and create domestic monopolies. And that's what they did until Woodrow Wilson was elected 50 years after the Civil War. A year after the Civil War ended, when the South badly needed to rebuild everything, including its railroads. Railroad iron was priced at $32 a ton in Liverpool, but $80 a ton in the United States. That's the real influence of protective tariffs, forcing us to pay exorbitant prices to a domestic monopoly. Moreover, since tariffs impeded the flow of imported manufactured goods from Europe, like railroad iron, Europe's industrialized countries could not readily generate the exchange credits, the dollars, that they would need to buy Southern cotton. Consequently, they increasingly looked for cotton feedstock in other countries, such as West Africa, Brazil, and Egypt, which hungered for European manufactured goods. Those countries wanted European manufactured goods, so they'd sell them cotton. The high tariffs were damaging to the South's cotton economy for those two reasons. It made it hard for the British to buy our cotton, and it created a domestic monopoly for the manufactured goods north of the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line. Not until Southern-born Woodrow Wilson's presidency from 1913 to 1921 did American tariffs decline. After the GOP regained the White House in the Roaring '20s, tariffs shot right back upward and stayed there until the Great Depression. Even Wilson's 8-year high tariff pause in high tariffs was an indirect testament to the Republican Party's power, and its extended dominance in post-bellum era. Wilson could not have won the presidency in 1912 without the Republican Party splitting between Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. As late as 1910, 90% of America's blacks still lived in the South, nearly 50 years after the Civil War. I could show you this on a graph, it would look better. But the point is, blacks did not go into other parts of the country. During the Civil War, when there were refugees, black refugees, referred to as contraband people, right? One of the senators from Kentucky, it was a big issue. What do we do with all of these refugees? Well, one of the senators in Kentucky, which was still Union loyal, so he put a bill into the Senate that the refugees should be distributed among the free state, among all the Union loyal states, according to population. The most ardent, the strongest abolitionist in the Senate at that time was Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. He was the guy that was hit over the head, just before, okay. He voted against that bill. He did not want the refugees distributed to the northern states in proportion to the state population. And not only did he vote against it, but his junior senator, Henry Wilson, also voted against it. And Henry Wilson, it's another story, but he had an affair with what was the woman spy in Washington? Yeah, Rose Greenhow. Rose Greenhow. Is that what you all were saying? Yeah, Rose Greenhow. Anyway, Henry Wilson and Charles Sumner voted against that Kentucky bill that would redistribute black refugees into the northern states in proportion to their population. So here he is, Charles Sumner, famous abolitionist. Yeah, let's get rid of slavery. Oh, but now, okay, well, let's move the freedmen up into your state in proportion of, no. So as I said, in 1910, 90% of the blacks still remained in the South. Only when Northern industrialists needed more workers during World War I did the North barely tolerate black worker migration. From 1915 to 1918, 3 years, America's unemployment rate dropped from 8.5% to 1.25%. That was because we were building arms, not just for our army, because we weren't in the war yet, but we were building arms for Europe. But anyway, the unemployment rate dropped sharply. About 500,000 blacks moved north between 1916 and 1919. Although Chicago was a prime destination, the Chicago Tribune urged blacks to, quote, stay south, and labeled their migration a, quote, big mistake, close quote, because they were, quote, lazy, shiftless, ne'er-do-wells, surely to become a burden on the city, close quote. In 9 months, from the summer of 1917 to the spring of 1918, Chicago whites exploded 58 bombs at black residences that were in previously all-white neighborhoods. The Chicago Property Owners Journal warned, quote, there is nothing in the makeup of a Negro which should induce anyone to welcome him as a neighbor. N-words are undesirable and entirely irresponsible and vicious, close quote. In 1919, a week-long race riot erupted in the city's south side, leaving about 40 people dead and 1,500 homes destroyed. Most of Chicago's black arrivals settled into slums. Toilets were in the hallways, yards, or in the basements. Overcrowding was common, and landlords often did not make repairs. In 1925, the death rate among Chicago's blacks was approximately the same as the death rate in Bombay, India. In 1929, the city's black Chicago Defender newspaper was advising blacks to stay south. Many European white immigrants entered the United States for the 60 years after the Civil War. Most found employment in industrial states north of the Mason-Dixon line and the Ohio River, while the rest generally settled in the West. Between 1860 and 1920, during those 60 years, 50 million white immigrants, equating to almost 1 million a year, came into the United States. Yet the North and West offered few opportunities for the 4 million freed slaves and their descendants until World War I created a worker shortage. So 50 million European whites immigrate, the 4 million blacks in the South have to stay there. The first black migration, termed the Exoduster Movement, failed because white hostility at the Kansas destination. Triggered by 1878 crop failures in the lower Mississippi Valley, the freedmen focused on Kansas partly because of the state's anti-slavery reputation earned during the Bleeding Kansas period. Even though the state had been famously anti-slavery, the Exodusters soon learned that it was not pro-black. The town of Lawrence, for example, raised money to quote, send these Exodusters undesirables to some other city, close quote. At Leavenworth, city officials refused to allow the Exoduster boats to dock. The town of Atchison passed a vagrancy law to deter impoverished blacks. Topeka citizens attacked a barracks for the blacks and that was built to house them, and they tore it down and they threw the lumber into the river. The short-lived movement ended suddenly after the Exodusters returned to the South, where they described Kansas as a barren country with a bleak climate. Then the Exodusters continued to filter home or move elsewhere until the 1880s. The point is that these were the first to leave the South in 1867, 2 years after the war. And they went to Kansas, and they found that they were not welcome there, and then they came back. Regarding the third point about famous statues honoring Northern races, consider Ulysses Grant. Although falsely portrayed as a civil rights champion, he promoted Southern black suffrage chiefly to manufacture Republican-controlled puppet regimes in the South. His civil rights efforts focused on the solitary racial minority. He focused only on the solitary racial minority of blacks because that was a large minority that could be considered reliably Republican loyal in their voting patterns. He did nothing for other racial and ethnic minorities such as Native Americans, Chinese Americans, or Irish immigrants. Moreover, he abandoned the freedmen after he concluded that his party could more likely remain in power by cutting them loose. Finally, due to the present race-obsessed culture, contemporary biographers minimize other failings, such as his administration's monstrous corruption. Despite Grant's modern reputation for civil rights activism, the experience of his second Attorney General, Amos Ackerman, suggests that the president had a hidden agenda likely to link to the corruption of the Gilded Age. Specifically, America's railroad industry had led him to subvert the interest of Southern blacks to those of the railroad moguls. Ackerman was the second of Grant's 5 attorney generals. He served a little over a year, from November 1870 to December 1871, and was the attorney general most vigorous in prosecuting the Ku Klux Klan. He expanded the powers of the newly created Federal Justice Department to expedite the prosecutions. About 600 Klan members were convicted. Grant, however, revealed that his interest in racial justice was secondary to big business when he abruptly asked Ackerman to resign in December 1871. Partly at the prompting of Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, the president had misgivings about Ackerman's, quote, obsession, close quote, with the Klan. Perhaps more importantly, Ackerman also frustrated important Northern capitalists. He was, for example, critical of the dubious terms under which railroads sometimes qualified for gigantic federal subsidies. In June 1871, he denied land and bond grants, federal land and federal bond grants, to the Union Pacific Railroad. Before resigning, Ackerman had confronted Grant's previous Attorney General, Ebenezer Hoar, when the latter was representing a railroad client's land grant claims. Ackerman told Hoar that the client had not completed the work required to qualify for the grants. Nearly simultaneously, Grant's Interior Secretary, Columbus Delano, complained to Grant that Ackerman had annoyed railroad moguls Collis Huntington, who was a partner to Leland Stanford, and Jay Gould with unfavorable rulings. Whether at the urgings of Fish, Delano, or Hoar, Grant replaced Ackerman with Oregonian George Williams, who later resigned under bribery accusations, as did Delano. The New York World reported in January 1872 that Williams's appointment was a triumph for the Pacific Railroads. The year after he became president, Grant signed the 1870 Naturalization Act, which favored black immigrants. Now, blacks born in the United States got citizenship through the 14th Amendment, but blacks that came in that were immigrants, they didn't get that. So they passed the 1870 Naturalization Act, which favored black immigrants compared to other so-called non-whites. Specifically, the act allowed blacks born outside the United States to become citizens through the same naturalization process available to whites. It did not, however, permit Chinese Americans and other non-whites to utilize the process. For decades thereafter, Chinese American rights were far more restricted than those of whites or even blacks. Chinese Americans, for example, could not become naturalized citizens of the United States until 1943, when some of them served in the U.S. Army. That right that the Chinese Americans got in 1943 was extended to blacks 73 years earlier. Although often praised for funding the KKK enforcement acts to protect Southern black voters, few historians realize that Grant spent much, perhaps most of the money to police the elections in the northern cities, where the immigrants, such as the Irish, voted for Democrats. Ultimately, the freedmen's loyalty to the GOP was not enough to sustain Grant's support. That became apparent during the autumn of 1875 with the elections in Mississippi and Ohio. Grant twice turned down requests from Mississippi's carpetbag governor to supply federal troops to police the polls during the election day in 1875, because the national sentiment, and the reason Grant turned it in is the national sentiment was turning against federal intervention in state affairs. 40 years later, former black Republican Mississippi Congressman John Lynch revealed that Grant confessed to him in November 1875, the same time as that election, that Ohio politicians told President Grant that intervening in Mississippi would likely cause Republicans to lose elections in Ohio. That's from him. Basically, Grant traded a Republican victory in Mississippi, which he could have gotten, for a bigger one in Ohio. He threw Mississippi blacks under the bus. Thereafter, the Republican Party steadily lost interest in Southern blacks. They became progressively less reliant on carpetbag regimes as the organically Republican states carved out of the Western territories entered the Union. Despite a false reputation among hagiographers for sympathetic feelings towards Native Americans, President Grant ignited an illegal war with the Plains tribes when attempting to lift the country out of an economic depression. Coincident with the 1873 flood of white immigrants into the northern Great Plains, a collapse in the railroad speculation sent America's economy into a tailspin. As it steadily weakened, Grant recalled how earlier Western gold discoveries had re-energized the economy. Thus, in the summer of 1874, he sent a military expedition into the Black Hills of present-day South Dakota to investigate rumors of gold. Since the hills were part of the Lakota Sioux Reservation and officially off limits to white civilians, the expedition's goal was falsely represented as a site search for a new military fort. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer led the expedition, discovering modest but tempting quantities of gold. Soon the first rush of prospectors began showing up. Initially, Grant made little effort to control the prospecting, but within a year he decided that the government must acquire the Black Hills. When the Indian leaders were summoned to Washington, they refused to relinquish the region. Grant ended the meeting with them by informing them that they must either cede the Black Hills or risk losing their rations. They departed without an agreement. Custer. Grant, therefore, contrived an excuse to start a war to justify seizing the hills by force. He planned to provoke the small minority of the Lakota who were living off the reservation in the, quote, unceded lands, close quote, where the Fort Laramie Treaty granted them hunting privileges. In November 1875, Grant called the general commanding the region and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to the White House. Together, the three of them prepared an ultimatum requiring the Indians to return to their reservation by the end of January 1876 or be declared hostile. In the dead of winter, it was an impossible demand. The result was the Battle of the Little Bighorn in June of 1876, which resulted in the deaths of Lieutenant Colonel Custer and 300 of his cavalrymen. But the Indian victory was only temporary. Indian Commissioner George Manypenny arrived 3 months later at the Sioux Reservation in September of 1876 to virtually dictate a settlement. He compelled the tribes to accept his terms by telling them that they would be moved to present-day Oklahoma, forfeit their firearms and horses, and no longer be supplied rations if they declined his offer. The Sioux descendants have litigated that settlement well into the 20th century. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court awarded the 8 tribes $106 million in compensation for, quote, a taking of tribal property, close quote. But the Sioux have refused it and said they want their lands returned. Prior to the Supreme Court ruling, a lower court judge wrote in 1975 concerning the Manypenny Agreement, quote, a more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealing will never in all probability, be found in our history. Close quote. Theodore Roosevelt. In addition to Grant, Theodore Roosevelt is commonly portrayed as racially enlightened because he was the first president to invite a black man to dine at the White House. Nonetheless, Teddy invited Booker T. Washington for a White House dinner 6 years after Atlanta's whites invited the black educator to be a featured speaker for the 1895 Cotton States Exposition. So let me put that in context. Yes, Theodore Roosevelt did invite Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner. 6 years after the Cotton Exposition, the whites organized Cotton Exposition in Atlanta offered Booker T. Washington a special place and a speaking opportunity at their convention. The Atlantans were so pleased when Booker T. Washington accepted their invitation that they devoted an entire building to exhibitions about black accomplishments. The largest part was devoted to exhibits about the Hampton and Tuskegee Institutes. Washington's speech was widely hailed by Southern blacks and whites. 5 years after his Booker-Washington dinner, Roosevelt wrote novelist Owen Wister, quote, "I entirely agree with you that as a race, the blacks are altogether inferior to the whites," close quote. He regarded the black person as a child. Quote, "I do not believe the average Negro is yet in any way fit to take care of himself," close quote. He disdained the Southern wing of the Republican Party as a set of, quote, "black and white scallywags and a few decent men," close quote. As for black suffrage, he said in 1906, this is Theodore Roosevelt, quote, "I know the Negro fairly well. I have seen him at close quarters in the Yazoo Delta, where he formed 90% of the population, and where universal suffrage in his hand is the vilest criminal farce," close quote. Although knowledge of the postbellum Northern racism, in my opinion, should not prompt narcissistic activists to tear down statues of Ulysses Grant or Theodore Roosevelt memorials, but hopefully it might cause the average American to pause before consigning Confederate memory to Dante's Eighth Circuit of Hell. That's reserved for hypocrites. And that's the end of my speech. I'd like